pointed out that there was something called Part 7A ITEPA, which came into effect in December 2010, and this has been cited as justifying the decision for the loan charge to apply from 2010 onwards. But I am advised by Alan Williams FCA, a constituent as well as a highly qualified professional, that this does not apply to the self-employed. So the self-employed, who are so often victims of this setup, ought not to be caught by a provision, by the assumed knowledge of a provision that didn't apply to them in any case. An eighth point is that the loan charge is not in any case full and final settlement, and therefore doesn't close open years. Even those paying the loan charge will see HMRC continuing to pursue further sums for so-called protected years in which loans were received. And the recommendation of Mr. Williams is that those accepting the loan charge should be afforded finality by making the loan charge full and final settlement. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I come to the conclusion that HMRC fell down on the job. They were asleep at the wheel. They bullied the victims and they let the villains who created these schemes get away with it. So HMRC in this case are not just bullies, they are negligent bullies. And the government should know when it's beaten, both morally and intellectually, stop flogging this dead horse and finally do the right thing.
Davey. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the honourable member for New Forest East, and I'm delighted to say on this occasion I agree with every word he says. And I think that is the nature of this debate, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's brought all sides together, people who aren't necessarily normally in total agreement on economic and tax affairs. It has brought us together for the reason that the right honourable gentleman member for Halton, Price and Howden said. It's about natural justice. Mr. Deputy Speaker, having set up the loan charge APPG last year, I think it has just become a group that illustrates the way the House has come together. We now have 227 members. We are co-chaired by my honourable friend, the member for Brentford and Isleworth, and our honourable friend, the member for Hemel Hempstead. I should say he wanted to be here today, but he has a family issue which kept him away. So not only do we represent, Mr. Deputy Speaker, colleagues from across the House, I believe we've gone about our business in a pretty professional way with the support of the Loan Charge Action Group as our Secretariat. We produced reports in the past, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and as a group we have reviewed the Morse Review itself, and we have published our response to the Morse Review. That follows two witness sessions where we had tax experts, we had loan charge victims, we received more written evidence, and we built on our previous work. And this 63-page report published today has 17 key findings on the Morse Review and makes 19 recommendations. I've been on a number of APPGs over my time in this House, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm sure you have. It's relatively unusual for an APPG to do such a thorough and detailed report in such short time. If I only have one disagreement with the right honourable gentleman member for Halton, Price and Howden, I wish he'd given us a little bit more time to do our work before this debate. I'm really pleased we've got this debate. And I hope the Minister, whatever he says from the dispatch box in response to this debate, will undertake to read the APPG's report and respond to it. When the Morse Review was set up, we welcomed it. It is what we had been seeking, and we had meetings with Zemias, and we gave him a huge amount of material. And it's fair to say, and to put on record on behalf of the APPG, that we welcome many aspects of his report. He talks about how unusual the loan charge is and how, frankly, unique it is, how it overrides statutory time limits which are meant to protect the individual taxpayer. That it looks back over 20 years. What an astonishing piece of legislation to put forward. It has a number of good recommendations. For example, it says that if the loan charge continues, after 10 years of repaying, any remaining liability should be written off if the taxpayer has earnings of less than 30,000. One would have thought that was a reasonable recommendation, Mr. Speaker, even if the government wants to stand by the loan charge, but they have rejected it. The government have rejected even that very modest recommendation. I would have thought Her Majesty's Treasury would and HMRC would have agreed with all the recommendations in the spirit of the Morse Review, but they haven't. Some they've rejected in full, some in part, and some they are interpreting in a way which is clearly not intended by the Morse Review. For example, Mr. Speaker, one of the group of taxpayers I've been most worried about is those who've had closed tax years. In other words, their tax affairs properly given to HMRC with all the relevant material and backup had been accepted and that tax year had been closed. Now, there can be no doubt that going back to such a year is complete and utter retrospection. Yet, the government are still seeking to apply the loan charge to those years, and they have narrowed in a most outrageous way the way we consider the concept of a closed tax year. So I'm really unhappy with the way the government has responded to the Morse Review itself. But the Morse Review does have a big flaw at its heart, which the Right Honourable Gentleman for Howden, Price and Howden set out in detail, and because he did, I won't need to speak for so long, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Essentially, what Morse says is that the law that was passed in 2011, the Income Tax Brackets Earnings and Pensions Act, and particularly Part 7A, made it clear. Now, the Right Honourable Gentleman showed that it didn't make it clear, even for those people directly linked to it because of the timings that he set out. But actually, in specific detail, the expert witnesses that we saw in the APPG made very clear that that legislation only covered some of the schemes that the loan charge applies to. Those schemes that involved employees who were being paid via a third party. But that legislation completely omitted entire schemes, entire existing schemes that involve the self-employed, that involve companies, that involve loans paid directly to employees. So there can be no doubt that that legislation that Morse was relying on does not apply to many people because they're just not covered by that legislation. It's not a question of debate, it's just a fact. And experts at the time looked at the legislation and responded in the way that you would. They looked at what the legislation said and changed their advice accordingly. And indeed, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs advice was based on what was actually in the Act, surprisingly enough. There's a 2016 technical note, which our report refers to, where HMRC specifically says that is what the legislation said. Now, I find it quite extraordinary that ministers, successive ministers, have tried to defend this, this double talk from HMRC. And as the Right Honourable Gentleman who opened the debate said, no court rulings in any way interpreted the legislation in the way that the Morse Review does. So while I have a huge amount of respect for Sir Amos Morse, I think on this point he is entirely wrong. And I've not seen, and I don't read all the tax literature, Madam Deputy Speaker, but the tax experts that have contacted us are really clear that Morse is getting the legislation, as it was understood at the time, completely wrong. Happy to give way.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for giving way to me. Could I ask him, when he took evidence, when the Right Honourable Gentleman took evidence, and took evidence from people who are subject to the loan charge, did he receive any evidence to the effect that their chartered accountants or their financial analysts since 2010 had told the people who they were being paid by that they were in real danger and they'd better actually change the way they pay their taxes?
For that intervention, we took no such evidence. No such evidence was proffered to us. It may exist out there, but we've certainly not seen that. Mr. Speaker, I don't want to detain the House any longer. I've made my core point, but I want to just summarise the whole reason why this has been such a big issue and why it's united the House. And that is that this is retrospective legislation. And it is unfair, and it is wrong. And we have to defend individual taxpayers, even if we think they might have been ill-advised to do it in the first place. We have to defend the law. And why do we meet in this House? Why do we pass laws unless we come back and say, government, you're breaking the law, and hold them to account for that? That is our constitutional job, and I want to thank right honourable members from across the House for doing their duty.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I too congratulate my right honourable friend for Horton, Price and Haldon and the Backbench Committee for securing this and others, this very important debate. It may not be the most pressing issue that we are facing at the moment, but it does address the deeply held concerns of constituents caught up in this injustice. And I say injustice because I truly believe that that's what it is, an injustice. Now, this debate is to look at the Morse Review, which I believe did have some welcome outcomes, but I don't believe for 1 minute it went far enough. Now, I believe, can I say at the start, I believe everyone has a duty and an obligation to pay their fair share of tax, and that anyone who evades tax should be rightly sought out and made to pay. But that isn't what we are dealing with here. Here we're dealing with, in many cases, ordinary people who were either forced or persuaded into schemes that they were advised were perfectly legitimate and approved by HMRC. And there lies the problem. And by way of example, I would like to share with the House an account of one particular constituent who is caught up in this and is facing a bill for tens of thousands of pounds and potential financial ruin. Now, I know that the government and HMRC have said that that will not be the outcome, but I assure you, looking at the details of his case, it would be. So my constituent is an intelligent individual, but by no means a tax expert. So when he gave up his job in 2011, deciding to work freelance so that he could get a better work-life balance, he was advised to join a freelancer scheme, a scheme established and promoted by an ICAEW-regulated chartered accountant. The promotional literature unambiguously stated that the accountant scheme was anodyne with no tax avoidance motive, HMRC words involved, legal and compliant, and supported by tax counsel. Tax counsel's opinion. However, at no point did the chartered accountant mention any known or future possible risks, either verbally or in writing. Simply, the chartered accountant positioned my constituent's use of the scheme through which he would receive a combination of salary and loans, as he was told this was perfectly legal and an effective tax planning tool. That said, in mid-2012, having noted some adverse media coverage of the subject of tax avoidance, my constituents sought confirmation from the promoter that the scheme remained truly anodyne, as had been stated when he joined it. The promoter's response was unequivocal. Nothing has changed. Later in 2012, a copy of an HMRC letter addressed to the promoter and dated the 20th of June 2012 was forwarded to my constituent in validation of the chartered accountant's previous assurances that the scheme was legitimate. The letter confirmed that for the purposes of mandatory disclosure under DOTAS legislation, HMRC's anti-avoidance group had formally reviewed the scheme and determined it could apply no hallmarks of tax avoidance. Therefore, of critical significance, HMRC stated the scheme was not disclosable. The unambiguous content of HMRC's letter gave my constituent absolutely no reason to consider its anti-avoidance group had undertaken anything other than a full, diligent review into the scheme, and with the absence of any adverse findings, meaning he could continue to use this scheme safely. But even then, as a cautious person, my constituent sought further confirmation from the promoter and was again reassured. Why would he not carry on using a scheme when he has sought so many reassurances? And I wish to restate that if HMRC had even the slightest concerns as to the legitimacy of the scheme and or my constituents' use of it, then its failure to openly communicate such concerns denied my constituent the clear and obvious opportunity to immediately depart the scheme in mid-2012. As it is, in late 2013, HMRC notified my constituent that it had opened a formal Section 9A inquiry into his use of the scheme, at which point he immediately ceased to use it. Regardless, to this day, more than 6 years after the launching of that Section 9A inquiry into my constituent's use of the scheme, the inquiry has remained open and he has yet to receive any technical argument from HMRC as to why it considers the scheme was unlawful. It is very clear to me that HMRC and the loan charge, or see the loan charge as a panacea for its historic and obvious failures. It's attempting to bypass my constituents' basic right as a taxpayer to have a court rule on any disputed alleged additional liability. We've heard from countless honourable and right honourable members and from esteemed independent tax practitioners that HMRC must, at the very least, be forced to desist using the loan charge to drive through this retrospective, unproven and ordinarily out-of-time claims that predate enactment of the Finance Act 2017. I strongly agree with that viewpoint and feel that it would be undeniably fair and entirely unreasonable to pursue people before that date. Therefore, in light of the uncertainties caused by the current situation with the coronavirus and the effect it is having on freelancers' ability to work and earn at this time, can I please ask that existing legislation be amended such that the loan charge is made prospective from 2017 onwards and remove at least one level of uncertainty for this important group of people at this very difficult time. Thank you.
Colleagues will see that there are a number of honourable and right honourable members wanting to speak in this debate and the debate afterwards. If we are to be able to get everybody in fairly, I would ask that speeches are 5 minutes. Neil Hart.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's indisputable that everyone should pay their fair share of tax to fund our public services, and if recent events have taught us anything, it has illustrated that we all rely on the response of those services, and any future threat of funding must be resisted. However, the Government's current position on this issue is frankly quite wrong and unjust. At 35 billion, the Government's official estimate of tax losses is now the highest it's ever been, yet the true figure of tax avoidance by the super-rich and corporations could be as high as 120 billion a year. My constituent, Doug Aitken, is facing a significant bill as a result of loan charge. This is money he simply hasn't got, and if HMRC persists, he will lose his home, his car, and being self-employed, the resulting bankruptcy will result in the loss of his business and his personal contribution to the Exchequer. Like many, he took independent advice from tax experts before entering the scheme and was reassured that it was operating within the law. He declared his income and submitted his tax returns. He set money aside ready to pay any tax liabilities, and he kept that money for the HMRC look-back period. He is not alone. I have a number of other constituents who've contacted me regarding this matter. Some are retired or are now surviving on benefits. They simply do not have the resources to pay. Others have spoken of the significant impact on their mental health. Whilst the changes to the look-back period from the most report may exempt thousands from being pursued, thousands more are still facing the prospect of absolute financial ruin. This is nothing short of a disgrace. Meaningful recovery is very unlikely, whereas bankruptcy is almost certain. In closing, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to offer my reflections on the key argument put forward by Sir Amos in favour of recovery. In his recent contribution to the House magazine, he explained that the advice he took about the legality was from tax experts. However, he also notes that the contributions from those who entered the schemes evidence that they did not understand the implications, i.e. they are not tax experts. And whilst Sir Amos may have sympathy with the loan charge recipients, pursuing them now is very unlikely to lead to any meaningful recovery. Having previously served the Health Service Ombudsman as a clinical expert, I was advised that I should not assess the treatment and care provided against my gold standard practice level. Rather, my judgment should be tempered to a level of what one could reasonably expect. And I would respectfully suggest that the current policy has measured those in the grip of HMRC over the loan charge against the gold standard of tax experts, and not, as it should have been, against the standard of what one would reasonably expect a layperson to understand. Whilst I firmly believe individuals should pay their tax that they owe, ruinous action from HMRC will help no one. The Government must act now to completely remove all retrospective action.
Paul Holmes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And firstly, can I congratulate my right honourable friend, the member for Alton Price and Howden, in securing this debate, and all members that are members of the APPG in being here today. Only having been in this chamber for only 4 months, I'm not as experienced in others in complicated tax arrangements. But very quickly, during the election, my election campaign, and during my surgeries, this issue has proven to be a huge worry for the many of my hard-working and honest constituents who run small businesses. But for me, this is not a debate, thankfully, that revolves around complicated tax issues. It's a debate that revolves around fairness and proportionality. And that's something that I think the government has got drastically wrong, and where I think the Morse review has not gone far enough. And if I can, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll briefly outline why. Now, like my honourable friend, the member from Basildon, I believe that everyone in our country must pay the taxes that they owe. Individuals, businesses, everybody. That's how a responsible society works. But the people that this affects are not tax avoiders. Therefore, I do have some concerns on behalf of my constituents about some aspects of the government's approach to this issue, and I believe it's my duty as a constituency MP to bring these up with ministers on the front bench. Many constituents have come to see me at a surgery and have told me of the severe pressure that this has put them under. The pressure of payment, possible insolvency, has caused, in some cases, the breakdown of marriages, physical exhaustion, suicidal thoughts, through no fault of their own whatsoever. I am also aware from my constituents that many of those who use some form of disguised remuneration scheme did so at the behest of financial professionals they had hired to advise them. Some were told that these schemes were HMRC compliant. Others were not even told that these schemes were tax avoidance and that they were normal procedure. And I briefly just want, Madam Deputy Speaker, to ask the Minister to consider the following points. Of course, any shortening of the time that the people affected by this are liable for these payments is welcome. But even after 10 years, the payments over 3 years is too regimented and draconian. What thoughts has the Minister had to lengthen its terms? It is simply not fair of the HMRC to impose the retrospectivity that follows from this review. As I've said, many people were advised by financial advisors and are now being penalised because of the late realisation and intransigence of the HMRC. Will the Minister on the front bench now accept that this shouldn't be a portent to any future decision-making when it comes to policy in this area? And what steps is the Minister taking to share the cost burden with financial advisors who recommended these schemes in the first place? It seems to me that they are being let away scot-free. And lastly, I want to raise the subject of the HMRC. Now, the HMRC at normal times is not the most transparent nor easiest of government departments to deal with. HMRC are not known for their empathy or human nature. It is vital that if the government continues down this path, and I really hope that they do not, that a bespoke and compassionate team should be set up to uniquely deal with the vulnerable people in our constituencies who are affected by this measure.
On that point.
Please, yes, sir.
I think that is a gross understatement of the lack of compassion that HMRC has. But I do want to say that if there is going to be a move forward in this area, that actually HMRC can give the certainty to individuals who have suffered under this situation of the loan charge, that there will be finality in the situation.
My honourable friend is absolutely correct, and I think what I agree with him entirely, and his point backs mine up, that actually any team that's set up by the Treasury to deal with people affected by this, and there should be one, look after these people as if they are people and not just numbers, which the HMRC unfortunately has a track record of doing. But there is... Of course I will.
I think he's really put his finger on one of the core points, which is who is running the show here? Is the HMRC running the show, or is the government making sure that the law on this matter is paramount? And does he not find it ironic that in this year, in the annual report for the HMRC, they say that they want a system that can be trusted and seen to be fair, with the right safeguards in place to protect customers? And doesn't this case just show that they're falling woefully short of that ambition?
I thank my honourable friend. I agree with him entirely, and this is not the only case in HMRC dealings that I think people are being treated unfairly, and I really hope that the Minister listens to the concern around the House, particularly about this issue today, but my honourable friend is completely correct. But to add to that, there is a wider point here about the HMRC, and that is that through, as my right honourable friend has said, through their own negligence, have decided to retrospectively charge these people for payments. Never again, and I do say this very strongly, never again should they be allowed to retrospectively adopt policies to cover their failures to get their policies in order. Lastly, the Minister needs to make clear that the people affected by this are victims, and that they are people who are struggling after following advice that was given to them by independent tax experts. I hope he will do that today. So I hope the Minister will look at lengthening the repayment period, a commitment to fairness in dealing with the people that are affected by this, and never allow this to happen again. But ideally, the Minister should get to the dispatch box this afternoon and ideally scrap the loan charges that are affecting so many of my constituents.
Alan Dorrans.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. May I first of all pay tribute to the members and right honourable members on both benches for their eloquence and detail in presenting their argument. It will prevent me from, save me some time in my speech. Thank you. It will allow me also to give a perspective from one of my constituents. I've received a number of constituent inquiries regarding this. I will highlight one. In 2008, a constituent was a pilot with Ryanair. He was employed by them. In a change in his conditions, he was no longer an employee. He was forced to become self-employed. He attempted to register as being self-employed, and he was asked a series of questions by HMRC, including, do I supply my own equipment? Obviously not. Ryanair supplied the plane. Can I work for who I want? Absolutely not. He was rotated to work for Ryanair. Can he nominate a substitute? He cannot, because he has registered with Ryanair and he's only allowed to work so many hours. So he therefore could not honestly answer these questions and become self-employed. A number of his colleagues did, but he was an honest man and he decided not to. So he then looked for alternatives, and he found a company in the Isle of Man, a group of accountants, qualified and recognised accountants, who presented him with a legal solution for payment as known as an employee benefit trust. He didn't really understand the implication of this, but he did due diligence and found that it was indeed legal and acceptable to HMRC. He proceeded with that system for 4 or 5 years and filled in his tax returns legally every year on time and declaring his usage of that particular scheme. In 2019, he was made aware of the loan charge. He came forward straight away to HMRC and offered settlement. He assumed they would treat him as an employed person and charge him for the tax that he was due to pay. So he waited for the settlement figures, and in the meantime paid £30,000 in accelerated payment notices, and in fact advanced payment of tax. That year he received a bill of £213,000, almost half of which is made up of interest and penalties. There was no allowance for the vast expenses he incurred. Ryanair made him pay for taxis, hotels and even water. No pension relief. They did not deduct the APNs he previously paid, and he had given all this information. He is still in dispute with HMRC. None of this is fair. This, for him and his family, has been a life-changing experience. He has been treated like a criminal. He has not evaded tax law. He believes he has acted legally at all times, and he refuses to allow HMRC to ruin his life due to their incompetence. Yep. He believes it's nothing more than bullying of individuals and all-powerful and out-of-control government body who should rather be pursuing the people behind these schemes. Therefore, Madam Deputy Speaker, to keep my speech short, as I appreciate you are very short of time today, I would say in the interest of natural justice and fairness, I would support this motion that the loan charge is an unjust and retrospective tax, and note that the loan charge was not settled until 2017, and call on HMRC to seize action on loans paid before 2017. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In 2018, when a group of constituents first came complaining about their treatment by HMRC to one of my surgeries, they were talking about loan schemes, of course. I wasn't particularly sympathetic. After all, why should a group of people use schemes to pay less tax than the rest of us? If they didn't pay their fair share, then others had to make it up. Or so I thought. But I was actually too harsh. Not that people shouldn't pay their fair share of tax, but more because I didn't understand the circumstances until they explained their predicament. First, the people I met clearly were not out to defraud the system. They didn't look or sound like petty criminals. They were normal, decent and honest. Some explained they didn't even have a choice, as we've heard. They either used a loan scheme, or they were not employed by the companies, or indeed the state in some cases. Second, as self-employed individuals, they were often contracted to different entities, and nobody but themselves, from what they earned, put aside anything for pensions, sick leave, paid holidays, or indeed guaranteed employment. They were much less secure than someone with a permanent job. In the interests of being quick, I will make 4 requests to the Minister. 1, I would like to see the retrospective nature of the charge removed up until July 2017, when the loan charge bill became law. That makes sense to everyone. Second, I think if that is not possible, I believe the government should revisit the settlement terms, which are hugely punitive. We've just heard from the last speaker how punitive they were. I would like to see a radical reduction in the extortionate interest rate charges and inheritance tax demands. Thirdly, all of us would find distasteful for the government to send out settlement terms using words that imply that people have deliberately broken the law. They did not. HMRC allowed the use of loan schemes. Every year they allowed, and they sent the tax return back, and people thought they were doing right. Finally, I see no reason why loan charge repayments should not be delayed by a year, rather like IR35, in response to the current health crisis we're all facing. Look, so many people are worried enough at the moment. Give them a break. Give them another 12 months. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Bambos Charalambos.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Let me start by saying from the outset that I'm no fan of tax avoidance, and the law on disguised remuneration schemes should have been, and now has been quite rightly tightened. But the aggressive retrospective action taken by the government in pursuing the loan charge policy and the profound effects this has had on many people's lives caused intense pressure on many of those affected and their families. There have been 7 known suicides from people who are facing financial ruin as a result of the demands for backdated tax from HMRC, even though it's questionable whether the tax was even owed. Relationships have broken down and it has affected people's mental health too. And it's also worth noting that HMRC have pursued individuals acting in good faith from those who enabled the disguised remuneration loan schemes. Thankful for small mercies, the fact that HMRC are now only pursuing schemes going back 10 years instead of 20 years is to be welcome, but many individuals are still caught by the current situation, and it seems that unlike in other areas of law, statutory time limits are of no consequence. When the Prime Minister was running to be leader of his party, he promised to review the loan charge situation, and this review was led by Sir Angus Morse. The report was published in December 2019, and whilst I welcome the recommendations of the Morse report, many of which the government have accepted, unfortunately it does not go far enough. The report also has one fatal flaw in that it concludes that the law was clear from 2010. There are a number of ambiguities which were around at the time, such as the situation related to those who were self-employed. And why, if the law was so clear at the time, did HMRC not enforce the law then, but instead chose to introduce the loan charge in 2017? As a member of the loan charge APPG, I call on the government to do a number of things. I asked them to amend the date that loan charge should apply from, instead of for 2010 to apply from when the Finance Bill got its royal assent in 2017, to ensure that closed tax years remain closed, and that those with income of under 30,000 should have any outstanding balances written off after 10 years, and that legislation should cover business owners and directors as well as individual contractors. The government and HMRC's reputation has been damaged by the way it's mishandled the loan charge situation. One principle that must underpin our legal and tax system is that things should be just and fair. And unfortunately, the loan charge and its aggressive application has been neither just nor fair. I'll give way.
Talking about that just and fairness is that as British people, we uphold, we have a rule of law which we uphold it. It's part of our very nature and fabric of Britain. And so talking about fairness and retrospective legislation in itself is against the rule of law.
The Honourable Member makes an excellent point, and it's very pertinent that we are here discussing tax going back 20 years, which quite clearly is unfair and unjust, and retrospective legislation shouldn't be applied in this situation. I want to finish by reiterating that we must also consider that beyond the financial aspect of tax recovery, we're dealing with real people who need to be treated with fairness and respect. We have a moral duty to ensure that no more homes are lost, no more bankruptcies filed, no more lives are lost, no more families broken because of the loan charge policy.
David Simmons.
Madam Deputy Speaker, like many of those who've spoken in this debate, I met many constituents during the election campaign and since who've been directly affected by it. I've had the opportunity to go through with them many of the contracts that they signed and indeed some of the advice that they received from many of the professionals who, I think we would all agree based on what's been said today, are the villains of the peace from the perspective of this House. I heard many examples where professionals who were paid, who people should have been able to rely upon providing good, clear and legal advice, have left those people in a very difficult financial position today. But I sympathise with the position that Sir Amias Morse found himself in. And I have to say I believe that what he has put forward in his report, although there are a number of points of concern that remain, does represent a reasonable attempt at a compromise to bring about a resolution of this situation. And it is my understanding that many of these legal cases revolve around the question of how you define a loan. The position of the Inland Revenue, as it was, and HMRC now, the money that you receive for doing your work and that you spend as your income is your income and should be taxed as such. And it's always been the case that the Inland Revenue and now HMRC permit both employees and directors to receive loans from the organisations that they are working for. In fact, many of our constituents will have access to things like season ticket loans provided on a regular basis, which are free of tax because they are loans. And from reading the contracts that many of my constituents signed and having heard in detail the advice that they received, it seems to me very, very clear that at the heart of this is a fundamental problem. The schemes themselves were lawful because it was lawful to receive a loan. But the money that the constituent received was only tax-free if it was genuinely a loan. And as 5, 10, 15, 20 years have gone by, and there is a complete absence of evidence that it was genuinely a loan, because the person has received that money as remuneration and spent it as their income, HMRC have quite naturally begun to take a lot more detailed interest in that. And this situation has left many of our constituents in a real bind. Now, I'm very mindful that when you read the proposals that come from Morse, what is proposed is a process of resolution which has a number of different avenues which the individual taxpayer affected can explore. And it does seem to me, and I hope the Minister will consider, that somewhere at the heart of this is making sure that individuals who acted in good faith, but notwithstanding that were badly and incorrectly advised by professionals, should be enabled to have the benefit of the fact that they acted in good faith when they signed their tax return, even if the information on it, prima facie, was not correct, because they were not intending to evade tax. They thought they were doing something that was within the law. And in summary, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm also very conscious that whilst we have heard a very vocal campaign on this during the course of the general election, 99% of taxpayers in this country never go near a scheme like this. And I've had quite a few of those taxpayers say to me that they find it hard to credit that anybody thought that by describing the pay they received for their work on their tax return as a loan, that meant they didn't and never had to pay an income tax on it. I will.
Thank the honourable member for giving way. Jeff, in my constituency, hard working, played by the rules, and the rules as far as Jeff was concerned and as advised by accountants, and even indeed the HMRC, was everything was in order. He's doing a good job and paying his way. It is about fairness, as members have said across the chamber, and justice.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think that's a point which everybody in the chamber is going to agree with. But fairness and justice clearly extends to this chamber making decisions that are appropriate for everybody. I'm very mindful of what my honourable friend, the member for Beckenham, said in his contribution about ensuring that everybody pays their taxes and everybody is treated fairly. And I simply wanted to say this, Madam Deputy Speaker. There's been, understandably, a huge outpouring of sympathy towards people who did not expect to find themselves facing a very substantial tax bill because they thought they had done the right thing. And I absolutely urge ministers to be as helpful and considerate as possible in approaching the settlement of that. But it is also clear to me, someone who worked as a professional in the financial advice business, not as a tax advisor when these schemes were being rolled out, that there are huge numbers of people who avoided them because they recognised that they were being asked to put something on their tax return which they knew was not correct. And therefore we have to strike the right balance in the way that we deal with this issue today.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to be able to speak in this important debate. I will be brief and focus my remarks on 2 or 3 key areas which have been partially mentioned by some colleagues earlier. I wanted to just thank the Right Honourable Member for Halton Price and Howden for securing this debate, and also to commend the work of the APPG and the cross-party nature of the debate today, which I think is very helpful. First and foremost, I do want to put on record my fundamental support for a fair tax system, we obviously need to raise taxes to pay for vital public services, but that system quite clearly has to be fair. And I think that the points made by a number of colleagues across the House on this matter are absolutely right, and I am grateful for the emerging consensus on this issue. Secondly, I'd like to just highlight the importance of the issue of the loan charge. I do think the fact that this debate is taking place today at a time of what is a period of sustained national crisis, and indeed a crisis for the whole world, is interesting, and it does underline the importance of this very issue. I certainly was approached a number of times during the general election. Like many members here today, I've had constituents who've contacted me about this issue, and there is deep unease in the community, certainly in the constituencies I represent, Reading East, which is made up of Reading itself and the neighbouring town of Woodley. There's deep unease about this problem, and many, many people are affected by it. And I noted the figure of 50,000 people across the country. It certainly seems to be higher than that in terms of the proportion of people in my community who seem to be affected by this. And I wanted to draw members' attention to both the effects on a typical town of its type, as Reading is, and specific industries where I believe there may be a particular likelihood of this problem arising. So in the areas I represent, there are a very large number of people who are self-employed, who have micro businesses or who work as consultants in one form or another. And that's spread across a huge range of sectors, from traditional small businesses through to people with trades, people with IT skills, public servants, a vast range of people. And I particularly wanted to add to the point made by my colleague, the Honourable Member for Ealing, when she spoke about the locums in public services who are affected by this. And I do know of cases where a number of people in public services have to work as set up a company and to work on that basis, perhaps as a supply teacher or in some other interim role in public services. And I should declare an interest in that. I've certainly operated in that way in the past as somebody who's an interim public servant, as well as in the more distant past, a full-time civil servant. So it is a well-known route of type of employment. A subset of those people are affected by the loan charge, not all of them. There's also in my area and many other nearby parts of the country or areas with similar high levels of employment in IT, a particular prevalence of self-employment amongst IT professionals. If you think of the great IT businesses in this country, companies like Microsoft or Oracle or Vodafone, many of them headquartered in the Thames Valley or West London, indeed some other parts of the country as well. Many of those large businesses rely very heavily on large numbers of subcontractors who have often no choice but to set up a limited company, which then serves a much bigger, larger organisation. And in my area, many, many people who are affected by the loan charge are in the IT industry. There are whole WhatsApp groups of people within particular parts of the IT industry which are buzzing with concern about this matter. And as has been said earlier, the issue ranges back over many years, and there's a deep sense of uncertainty and pressure on these people, on these workers and their small businesses, and indeed their families, because of this whole problem. And I should add that we also, as I said earlier, we're debating this at a time of national crisis. Just imagine how that concern overlays itself on top of the existing pressures that we've talked about earlier today and yesterday. Quite rightly, in this House, we've discussed and raised the matter with the government, the importance of supporting small businesses at this time of national crisis. Imagine how it feels to be a small business person or an IT subcontractor where you are the breadwinner in your family. Your source of income could dry up because of this crisis, which is not of your making, which you have not anticipated. And at the same time, you face the long-standing problem of the loan charge looming over you, with the very grave measures which other colleagues have mentioned today, and some of them truly are dreadful, the examples that have been mentioned. And imagine that pressure, and that's, I think, what we need to do today, to think about what this feels like to somebody who is a small business person who is self-employed. And I would just urge the Minister, I know he's a very dutiful and well-read Minister who, as was said earlier, has written a biography of Adam Smith. I do hope that he will look again at the evidence very, very clearly and very thoroughly and look at this in the context of the current situation affecting small businesses. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I want to thank the Backbench Business Committee for allowing the debate when I know they had a backlog of requests from many important issues. Also, my fellow sponsors of this debate, my fellow chairs of the loan charge at APPG, particularly the Right Honourable Member, for Kingston and Surbiton, and also the member for Hemel Hempstead, who's unable to attend today as he's dealing with a family medical emergency, and we wish him well. We also want to thank the officers of the Loan Charge APPG and of the Action Group. I can confirm that the three co-chairs of the APPG, we're from the three different parties, we all endorse the APPG report that was released tonight and is on our website. It's a pleasure to follow many members who have described in vivid terms the experience their constituents have faced, so I won't dwell on those too much. I have similar experiences. Madam Deputy Speaker, at this time of incredible worry for most people in this country, for their loved ones, their neighbours and for themselves, many, perhaps most of our constituents, are facing catastrophic and even absolute loss of income. And whilst this debate is wholly unrelated to the COVID-19 virus, the victims of the loan charge scandal who were already worried by their financial futures, so the coronavirus outbreak only heaps more agony on top. Now, I agree with the points others have made about tax avoidance, but this is not about tax avoidance, which we abhor and would like to see closed down on, but this debate is about natural justice, has been said by so many. Now, when the APPG started, the Treasury and former members of the government said there was no problem with the loan charge, and it was a perfect piece of government policy. They said there was no need for a review of the government policy, so the Honourable Member for Kingston and Surbiton put down an amendment calling for a review. We had a debate in this chamber almost a year ago, and a Treasury report that was a whitewash, frankly. But because more and more members of this group, of this House, were being contacted by worried taxpayers describing the bullying of HMRC and the fear for themselves, their families and their work, we kept standing up, we kept asking questions, and we kept lobbying ministers. The Prime Minister, in his leadership bid, promised to hold a full review into the loan charge. And then we had the review, led by the highly respected Sir Amyas Morse, whose report was released on the 20th of December, and on the same day HMRC released their response. Now, for taxpayers, the Morse review means they are looking to the future, and I've heard a number of extremely troubling cases from my constituents who've faced the loan charge, and this is about HMRC behaviour. My constituents provided all the information asked for and heard nothing back for 10 years. They received a note from HMRC saying they were facing the loan charge with interest added, including for the 2 years when they had complete radio silence from HMRC. How is that justified or proportionate? And based on evidence to us, and I assume to Sir Amyas, along with casework and conversations with colleagues, some casework wholly unrelated to the loan charge, it feels like HMRC are just not capable of providing a competent service. Now, others today have rightly addressed the anxiety and uncertainty that taxpayers are facing, being chased for almost immediate payment for sums they just do not have, and without any justification of the sum demanded, and usually completely ignoring the last information they sent into HMRC. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to just cover briefly poorly paid and vulnerable people. The Morse Review recommended that after 10 years, the loan charge should no longer apply for people who earn less than $30,000 a year. But the government rejected that recommendation. Let's remember these are many of them working in the public services, the NHS, local authorities, many of whom don't have accountants, many of whom were effectively in a position where they were told if you want this work, you sign up to this umbrella scheme, and the head clients won't no longer contract with personal services companies. So these umbrella schemes are all that's available for them. Now, so we've got social workers, junior doctors, nurses, cleaners, etc. facing year after year of many charges. To address this injustice, Sir Amyas made a reasonable request. HMRC shouldn't chase loan charge payments between 2010 and 2016 if the individual made a reasonable disclosure. But this was changed by the Treasury to the word full disclosure, a term that, according to tax experts, I understand has little or no relevance in tax law. So where do we go from here, Madam Deputy Speaker? For months and months we heard the government say this is not retrospective, retrospective again and again, yet they agreed with Sir Amyas Morse and shifted the date the loan charge applied from 1999 to 2010. So if they can change their mind once, surely they can do it again. If the government can defer the rollout of IR35 to the private sector, as they did earlier this week, following extensive concerns, they can change their mind on the loan charge, I hope. The new suggested cut-off date of the 29th of December 2010 is based on the law being clear, yet we know now that this was not the case. If the law was clear then, why did we need the loan charge and another change in legislation in 2016? I do just want to very briefly list some of the other concerns that are in our report, not already raised in this debate, but the Madam Deputy Speaker is coughing at me, so I would urge anyone reading Hansard or in this debate today to please look at the report that we released last night and is on the Loan Charge Action Group and the Loan Charge APPJ website. So I will finish by coming back to a core question. Is applying the loan charge from 2010 justified and proportionate? The answer from the APPG is no. And I go further. I ask, is HMRC abiding by, as was mentioned by at the beginning of this debate, is HMRC abiding by Adam Smith's principles of fair taxation? And furthermore, I also want to add that, is HMRC and the Treasury abiding by the Nolan principles of public services, particularly selflessness, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty and leadership? I urge the government to listen to this strong opposition that exists against this retrospective, unjust and unfair tax. I urge the government to simply do the right thing.
Sarah Olney.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm going to obey your instruction to be brief by merely commending the contributions to this debate from the Right Honourable Member for Halton, Price and Howden and my Right Honourable friend, the Member for Kingston and Surbiton. I merely want to add that as a member of the accounting profession, I've been somewhat abashed during this debate. We are not coming out of this well. I was contacted by a constituent of mine, Dr. Nausheed Baig, who is an NHS doctor, a dentist, I beg your pardon, and he contacted me. He's a dentist. He's there to practice his skills of dentistry. He takes full responsibility for his tax affairs, and he does that by consulting a professional tax advisor. And I do believe that HMRC should always take into consideration the fact that taxpayers, in taking responsibility for their affairs, are not expected to be tax experts themselves, and it is perfectly reasonable and perfectly rational to consult and take advice from people like myself, qualified accountants. I haven't ever given charge for tax advice, so I don't have a declaration to make. But it's perfectly reasonable and perfectly rational, and that should be taken into account. I wanted to raise the case of another constituent of mine, Mr. Michael Bilton, who is now retired, and his wife is on the verge of retirement as well, and between them they take care of their disabled daughter. Now, Mr. Bilton was in a loan charge scheme, prior to 2010, and only received notification a few years ago of the large sums of tax that he was now required to pay. He's already paid a considerable sum. The outstanding liability is of considerable concern to him as he and his wife prepare for retirement and to take proper care of their disabled daughter. I would urge the Minister to think about those people who've already paid large sums. Sir Amyas Morse has confirmed that anything prior to 2010 should not be liable to a charge, and I would really urge the Minister to consider rebates for those people who have paid vast sums already into a scheme that has now been judged to not give rise to a charge. I realise that there are considerably more pressing issues, but if that could be attended to in due course, I would be extremely grateful.
Fleur Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I also congratulate the Right Honourable Member for Halton, Price and Howden for securing this important debate at a time of national crisis. This is a crisis for 50,000 people across the country for whom this will exacerbate the already difficult mental health and economic situation they face. And I really welcome the agreement that is across the House in this debate. Before I begin, I want to make clear that this debate is not about protecting and keeping in place loopholes and avenues for tax avoidance, and to join with other members in saying that tax avoidance is a scourge, and any initiative or legislation aimed at tackling it has my full support. But what I do not support is cruelly punishing over 50,000 people and their families, hard-working entrepreneurs, and who acted in good faith, but is often driving them to suicide. And I have met many constituents in my surgeries who've been in tears as a result of the effect that this has had on their family. And one constituent was hit by a bill for £158,000 plus interest 5 years after retiring. There is no way that this constituent can repay this charge. He was advised by his accountant in 2007 and entered into employment via loan remuneration scheme was entirely legal. And this is a theme of those constituents who've been to see me. They say that they found out that these schemes were QC approved. They felt they were entirely legal. They did their due diligence, but have found that the law here has failed them. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, while the government's decision to accept most of St Amyas's recommendations is a very welcome step, the loan charge as it currently exists is still grossly unfair and is destroying lives in my constituency and across the country. In the interest of time, I will cut to my 6 points. I would like to urge the Minister to considering these following changes. First of all, to call off the dogs during the coronavirus situation and to pull off the threat of these huge charges from our constituents. This is a mental health crisis for many, many people. Second, the date that the loan charge looks back to should be amended from December 2010 to the date of Royal Assent of the Finance Bill in July 2017, as the law was not clear. Third, to accept the Morse Review recommendation that unprotected or closed tax years should now remain closed. To accept the Morse Review recommendation that those incomes with incomes under £30,000 should have any outstanding tax balances written off after 10 years of making a genuine attempt to pay on the terms that have already been announced. The legislation must treat business owners and directors equally with individual contractors. And finally, that anyone still using these schemes, and I have been astonished to find out that this is still going on, that they should be told of the liabilities that could be facing them or that are facing them immediately.